Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico.
And we're back. We're growing boys. We can't stop talking about growth and how it happens and what's going on. And I got to tell you, Matt, I've had a little bit too much coffee today, and it's my first day back to work. And my neighbors are yelling at each other, and my wife's cooking, and I feel like it's a very chaotic environment, but I also feel like what a great kind of headspace to be in to talk about how insane capitalist growth is, in fact, in our world today.
Okay, I'm going to tell you something awful in a similar vein. So over the weekend, I climbed a mountain with some friends in Scotland, and on the way up the mountain, first of all, let me say I was huffing and puffing so much that I couldn't talk about anything. On the way down the mountain, I had a little bit more space to breathe, and I did definitely tell the three other normal people I was with about about growth and climate change. And like on the way back, even in the car on the way home, I started explaining why like unemployment is necessary for a growing economy, and like anyways, I'm probably a really fun person to be around right now. Just really deep in the paint of this whole situation. I like literally on top of a mountain in Scotland, like still boring people to death about economic growth. Stupid.
I mean, you're just trying to degrow the mountain, which is too big, if you ask me. You gotta shrink it.
And maybe if I talk a bit more about the monthly review, I can make it a bit smaller.
That's right. And just like debt crises are a contagion within the banking system, our own fixation on growth has become a contagion in our own natural lives. And you, dear listener, unfortunately are about to get sick because we are going to talk about growth again for another hour. Last time on the show, we talked about the GDP and how weird it is and bad it is and silly it is. And this time, we're going to talk about something more complicated, but maybe also kind of more important to figure out, which is how capitalism grows at all. The GDP, it's a bad number, but even if you got rid of the GDP, you'd still have a lot of the problems that we see in an economy oriented around growth, because capitalism can't stop doing it. Literally, it's got to do it. If it doesn't do it, it has a bunch of big problems. And we've talked about this a little bit on the show in a bunch of other places. In particular, maybe it was a year ago, 2 years ago, we read the book Monopoly Capital by Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy, the kind of patron saints of the monthly review. Man, it is a boring book, but we did read it, and we talked about it a lot. And we're going to talk about it again, along with some other stuff, as we've been slowly completing the puzzle in our own brains about how growth really functions in our very weird economy. So we're going to take you through it this time, and it's kind of also, again, an excuse for us to figure out what we're trying to say in this book. So I guess you get to be, observers to how Matt and I are sorting out what we should say in this book that we're trying to write that is due very soon. Matt, am I missing anything else explaining this roadmap to the next hour of our rambling conversation?
No, I think that makes sense. Dean and I are writing a book where talking about capitalism is a big part of it, and we are deep in the paint of understanding how it works. This used to be a podcast where we talked about things that were happening in Latin America in the 1970s, and that was really exciting. Maybe someday we'll be that podcast again, but for now, we're a podcast about economics. Sorry.
I'm just looking at my computer screen while we're recording this, and I have no less than, I'm counting them now, 8 tabs of the monthly review open, along with several other tabs, including reports from the IMF and the Economist and the Financial Times, and it is just, I hate looking at it. It makes me feel like such a dork and a huge nerd, and it also is really building a sense of resentment toward capitalism in myself because, man, I don't like an economic system that makes me read so much boring stuff in order to figure out why it's ruining my life, but here we are.
No way.
And
no way.
I guess we're going to do it again.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about monopoly capitalism and get this show on the road. Like Dean said a minute ago, we talked about monopoly capitalism like maybe 2 years ago when we read a book called Monopoly Capital by Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy. 2 big monthly review guys. Dean, do you want to give an introduction to monopoly capitalism, or I'll just jump in whenever I feel like it's necessary?
Sure. Great. It will definitely be necessary. The monthly review, for people who don't know, it's a socialist magazine in the U.S. that's been around for a long time, and it's very interesting. It's not a perfect publication by any stretch, but it has a really particular kind of economic analysis that's been developed over the decades and is still being developed in some interesting ways. And a lot of it hinges on the idea that capitalism, the way we kind of are trained to think about it, is to figure out that it's a super competitive system. It's a dog eat dog economy, and the dogs are eating the dogs, and it's a rough place, right? There's all this competition, and whoever wins in the competitive arena, those are the people who win the capitalist game. And that is true to an extent. It's not like capitalism doesn't have competition. It has lots of competing things happening all the time. But something that the Monthly Review economists kind of worked out in the last century is that really what we see is a tendency in capitalism to grow to a kind of level of stability in monopolies, or kind of big corporations that control gigantic sectors of the market. And those monopolies, rather than kind of ruthlessly competing with each other, they sort of agree to set prices and keep prices at basically the same level in order to maximize their profits. And there's lots more to be said about it, and we'll say a lot more about it. But that is a big innovation in Marxist theory and in economic theory. And maybe one of the key points is to say what those monopolies are doing is growing a surplus value. That's the key. They're always trying to build their surplus or profit. And that kind of growth of profit, it works pretty effectively, but it also creates a ton of problems within capitalism, contradictions in capitalism. And those problems lead to all kinds of things like recessions and depressions and financial crises and so on. That's kind of the basic thesis of monopoly capital, trying to figure out how do monopolies work, why do they work the way they do, and what are the kind of unique problems that they have to solve and don't solve, or try to solve in a lot of really weird ways. Does that seem like a good baseline, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The monopoly capital bit is really important because whether you are interested in economics or not, and like most of us aren't, and I think that's a healthy approach, is not being interested at all. But whether or not you're interested, you end up learning stories about capitalism and how it works, right? Just like just a minute ago, you're talking about, it's capitalism is all about the dog eat dog world of of competition, and like it is true, there are some companies, businesses out there that are like legitimately competing with one another, but there's also a whole slew of other corporations out there that are not competing with each other. Whenever I think about the whole situation of monopoly capitalism and trying to like explain it to people, I always think about these two donut shops in St. Louis that are like legitimately competing with one another. There's one that's called John's Donuts, which is really good. It's the best one. And then there's one that's called Pharaoh's Donuts, and it's not as good. And they're super small, and they're always worried about making their rent and selling enough donuts to cover the cost of labor and buy things and so on, right? Like they are legitimately competing with one another. And someday, one of them could put the other one out of business. And that is probably what will happen. I don't know. Whatever. That sucks to be them. It's not me. But, like John's Donuts, as good as I think they are not competing with a company like Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts or whatever, right? There's no competition between those two because in scale and in the way that they function, it is completely different. It is like not donuts and donuts. It is like donuts and a big cake or something like that, where like Starbucks and I mean even the example of Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts put together, those are also two companies that have like similar market niches or whatever, but they're also not really competing with one another in any real sense of the word, right? So monopoly capitalism gives us like a way to think about these big corporations in the world and how they actually work together in kind of like an ad hoc way to create a system that works for both of them. So they can both like pretend to undercut each other a little bit, but never so much that either will go out of business. It's sort of like a way to collude together to make sure that they're getting the biggest amount of profits out there.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this more later in the episode, but as I said, the more they grow, the more actually problems also start to emerge, and they have to solve those problems, or kind of the capitalist economy as a whole has to solve those problems. Which it often either doesn't do or does in incredibly weird ways. And we'll save this for the back half of the episode, but I think the most interesting thing to me has been seeing how the Monthly Review kind of tradition of thinking about economics has tried to make sense of financialization, or the kind of the rise of like stocks and credit and mortgages and real estate, all these things that are not exactly like commodity markets, but have to do with a kind of like fake or made up economy. And as we'll talk about later, the problems that are inherent in monopoly capitalism have kind of led us to this place where these days the big economic players are not really even the kind of traditional commodity monopolies of, I don't know, people who make cars or food or whatever. More and more, there are people who don't make anything at all, who make bets, more or less, in the market, in the stock market, where kind of money makes more money, and that's it. So we'll figure out why that is the case later on. But what is fascinating about the monthly review is if you want to know why everything is so fake and so weird in the economy, you actually have to start with kind of the normal operations of things, or the physical reality that we do in fact share, despite the fact that the stock market is out there.
Man, I feel like when you start talking about financial capitalism, I realize how long of a road there is ahead of us in getting to it. So before we get to financial capitalism, I guess we have to get to the sort of like the natural problem of monopoly capitalism. Okay, so like Dean was saying, in monopoly capitalism, you have all these big corporations who are kind of like working together to more or less set prices within a particular market niche, right? Like you got Dunkin' Donuts, you got Starbucks, you got, I don't know, other coffee-ish shops, kind of like that, like sort of big corporation coffee shops, who can set the price for a cup of coffee and a pastry or whatever at a certain amount. They're setting their prices at a certain level so that it kind of works out for the best of everybody in this like particular market niche, so that they can make the most money off of consumers. And that is, as you might know, the whole point of capitalism is to make the most amount of money that you can. From the Marxist perspective, whether you're talking about Karl Marx or two guys that are like further down the line, like Paul Brand and Paul Sweezy, in capitalism, when you have a company or whatever, a business making a product, you have this thing that's called surplus. So surplus in Marxist economics is like the difference between the wages that you pay a worker and the amount of money that you get from selling a commodity that they create. So it's kind of like a little bit of like math in the middle there. But basically the idea is that like that's the surplus is like what the company, the capitalist, the corporation, they get to kind of take that and do what they will with it. So it's actually a pretty big problem within the framework of monopoly capitalism to figure out what it is that you're supposed to do with the surplus that you're getting from that like math between the worker creating and selling. If you took all that money, that surplus that you have from the production process, and you just like reinvested it back into the production process, you would have a huge problem on your hands. The huge problem is that you would have made a production process that is too efficient. You're going to end up creating like too many commodities out there in the world. Too many commodities mean that you're not going to sell as many because like you'll overshoot your market. You'll create more than is actually being demanded. So you end up with this huge problem where you've created too much. The whole strategy of monopoly capitalism is to find new and exciting and increasingly stupid ways to absorb that surplus back into your business that is not investing it in production, and it is definitely not going to be giving it to your workers for a handful of reasons. So capitalists find things to do with the surplus that they create in the production process, and they have to find places to kind of like stash all that cash. So you might put some of it back into the production process. Like you might make some machines a bit more, effective or efficient or whatever. You might train your workers a bit more. You might give some people some raises, some small ones, right? Like 2% a year, 2.5%, whatever, just enough to cover inflation. But then you might also do some other things with it, like give your CEO at the top or your other C-suite executives a nice big bonus because they're doing such a good job of exploiting workers. You might spend some of that money on like market research, and you might spend some of that money on public relations, and you might spend some of that money on opening new factories or like breaking into the market of a country that doesn't have your product yet. You got to get some more Dunkin' Donuts over in Europe or whatever. I don't know. But also you can do some other crazy things with it. Like putting it into finance, into insurance, into real estate. This is like the beginning of the financialization of accumulation, where you take that surplus that you've created and you just find like other weird and imaginary places to stick it, because you can't just easily put it back into the production process. Dean, I feel like I've said so much weird stuff. I feel like I'm explaining Star Trek to somebody who's never seen a single episode. And I don't know if I'm like super detached and I'm just like talking nonsense, or if any of this makes sense.
No, it does make sense. I think you're hitting all the high points, and it does sound like Star Trek, because it is kind of like Star Trek. Capitalism is essentially science fiction. If you think about it, it's not real. We made it up, but we are all forced to role play in it every day. I think the key here is to kind of identify that, like, when a monopoly grows all of its money or all of its surplus or whatever, as you said, you can't just dump it back in the production process. I can't remember if we talked about this last week or not, but I don't know. I guess I'll say it again if we didn't. Contextually, it matters. The example I always think of with this is Funko Pops, which for whatever reason have become my specific symbol for everything that's wrong with capitalism. Funko Pops, they're little vinyl toys that you've seen in Hot Topic or whatever. Funko Pops, there was like tons and tons and tons of them made, especially during COVID, but before that too. And after COVID, they discovered that they had made too many Funko Pops, and they had a big problem. They were storing all these Funko Pops in like storage units, so they were renting space to just like house their inventory. And at a certain point in 2023, they sort of cut their losses, and they were like, we're never going to sell all these dang Funko Pops. And instead, we're going to send $30 million worth of them straight to the garbage dump. And so they did that because it's cheaper for them to do that than to keep storing them. And they don't think they're going to move the product anytime soon. So the problem that Funko Pop had is they invested too much of the surplus they were making, too much of the big profits they had, back into making more and more Funko Pops until they were drowning in a sea of Funko Pops. They have to throw them in the garbage, because if they just put them in the market, it will depress the price of all the other Funko Pops. Like, people will sell them for less, or they won't be able to sell them at all, and then people won't want to buy them. So there's lots of reasons that they can't just kind of like, I don't know, get them out. It is like a good example, I think, because they're trying to figure out what to do with their success. They have too much money, and the problem is they just kept putting it into being better and better at getting Funko Pops on the shelf, but it caused all these other problems. So I mean, maybe that just helps like give a little bit of a particular example to all these weird processes that you can get lost in when you're thinking on the economic side.
And if that doesn't help, let me tell you about this. There's an episode of SpongeBob where SpongeBob and Patrick have a sort of disagreement with Mr. Krabs, and they end up opening up their own sort of like business to sell what they call pretty patties. So they're like Krabby Patties, but they're like different colors. And they become like wildly popular. And everybody in Bikini Bottom has got to get their hands on a pretty patty, and they keep making all kinds of money. And at one point, Mr. Krabs is like, how much money are you guys making? And they're just like, I don't know, man. We got so much money. We've tried everything. We've tried burning it. We've tried burying it. Now we're just giving it away. And it's exactly that, though. I mean, it's like it is exactly the SpongeBob problem, where you get too good at capitalism. You got too much stuff, and you got too much surplus that you're gleaning from the process of production and selling of commodities, and you have to figure out something to do with this money. And you can't just keep like can't keep producing, because you'll outrun the actual demand. So I don't know. Sometimes it ends up being more cost effective to just throw all of your Funko Pops or Krabby Patties away, or burn your money in some other stupid wasteful way. Like, it literally doesn't matter. Throwing the Funko Pops away ends up solving a problem, like a business problem for Funko Pop, to do that. It is a benefit to them to just chuck them in the trash, which is bad, as you can imagine, from a few different perspectives. The biggest being sort of an environmental perspective, where like Funko Pops are not made from recyclable plastic, and you got to know they were not recycled in that whole process either. So like virgin petrochemicals used to create your favorite Star Wars character, and then immediately thrown into a dump when it like didn't sell in the right amount of time. It's just like a completely stupid system that we live within, but that is That's it. That's the one that we do live in. It's like, it might as well be the SpongeBob episode, you know? It's like, whatever. It's just as stupid as that.
Yeah, exactly. And just, I mean, we're talking about Funko Pops, but it doesn't even have to be only Funko Pops. Every year, literally tons and tons of t-shirts are dumped into a desert in Chile, for example, because we make too much clothing that is like fast fashion and meant to be, ripped off the shelves or whatever. There's lots of problems in food overproduction, all these kinds of things. And it's a kind of like systemic problem in capitalism that's actually surprisingly hard to solve. Baran and Sweezy say if you have a surplus, you can basically do three things with it. You can invest it, which sometimes you have to. And if you do it too much, you'll be in trouble. You can waste it. Wasting it is done in lots of different kind of ways. One of them, it might sound strange to call this a waste, but one of them might be advertising, for example. They say that it's wasteful because it's not really like producing anything, but it goes into the sales effort. You're trying to get your particular product sold, but it's not productive. And they had a really kind of big analysis of that because they were writing in the 1960s, which is when advertising really had a big boom. Before that, advertising wasn't a big deal. So that's one way that you can get rid of your surplus. And the last one is that you can consume it, which is maybe the easiest one to wrap your head around. You just pay your CEO a big bonus, and then they eat it up. They use their surplus to, I don't know, shoot themselves into space or something. Whatever capitalists do with their dumb piles of Scrooge McDuck money. And those three ways of absorbing surplus, they're pretty like standard. But as a global economy, or even as a national economy, something Brandon Sweezy point out is that for a lot of different reasons that we won't go into because it's very boring, these three things kind of have their own limitations. You can't just consume your capital away, for example, or you can't just put it back into the production process or waste. And if you kind of keep amassing all that surplus and have nowhere for it to go, you end up creating these really weird problems of economic stagnation, which is to say your economy is not growing at the rate that you need it to. So the irony of being too good at growth is the more you grow, the more you actually end up in these problems where the growth is unmanageable and it stops growing. And if your economy stops growing, you have lots of other problems like people can't keep their jobs, or you can't, pay to keep producing stuff. So it creates these cyclical problems where you want to grow a lot, but if you grow too much, you'll be in big trouble. And once things start kind of like reversing or going into a recession, a lot of people suffer, and then eventually the kind of growth pattern, starts over again. Does that seem like kind of the basic operation here, Matt? At least going from Funko Pops to Krabby Patties to to how the surplus does or doesn't get absorbed.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, at least from my extremely warped perspective at this point. The thing that is kind of interesting about it is, again, this kind of goes back to like the story we tell ourselves about capitalism, or the story that we learn, I don't know, from whoever tells us about capitalism in our life. You absorb it, I guess, via osmosis. But like the tendency is to think of like capitalism as this like sort of cutthroat game. We talked about that already, when it's less of a cutthroat game unless you're running a small donut shop, very specifically. But also there's like this story about capitalism where it's all about these big booms and busts. Like you're going to strike it rich and then, oh no, you've fallen into complete depression or something like that. And I think that the other part of monopoly capitalism that you're talking about here, about stagnation and trending towards stagnation, is actually really important because it paints a different sort of view of capitalism. Not one where there's like huge swings in exactly how it works, but that there's like sort of like, some things that you can do with your money, with your surplus, to create small and regular amounts of growth that you're just trying to kind of push forward just a little bit more to make sure you're not running out of steam, that you're not going to get into the stagnation territory. So I guess all that to say, I think that the picture of monopoly capitalism ends up looking quite different than the one that maybe we think about in our minds whenever we imagine how capitalism works. It's not about Wild West cowboy businessmen striking it rich and then blowing it all on like one bad bet. Though I guess there is a lot of that actually that we're going to talk about in a minute. But it is like, it's about creating a system that hopefully can sustain a certain amount of growth and kind of like count on that growth in the future.
Yeah, exactly. The key is kind of sustainable growth, which is a contradiction in terms, as Brian and Sweezy point out. Lots more to be said about surplus. Maybe just like one last kind of weird left field thing to introduce here that I think is super interesting. Surplus, one thing that Marxists often will talk about is that you can do a lot of things with surplus, including imperialist stuff, or you can invest it in weird stuff. And governments also, they increasingly in our neoliberal time, when they think like corporations or work with corporations a lot, they tend to treat their surplus in weird ways as well, where a government which gets its surplus not in the same way that a business does, it gets it through taxation, or I guess in some cases through having like public companies or whatever. But it's not the same as like a capitalist trying to make as much money as possible. When a government has a surplus, they could invest that in lots of interesting things, right? Public health care, a postal service, I don't know, whatever governments could do and don't tend to do good things. And what that really means is when they have a surplus, they kind of do one of two things with it, usually. Either they try to reduce it, they use it as an excuse to be like, we don't have to take all this money through taxation, so they cut taxes or whatever. Or they will invest their surplus in things that they think will like boost the economy, but more often than not are actually incredibly weird and in some cases very violent patterns. So for example, the military is one pretty obvious place, and Brandon Sweezy had a lot of things to say about that the military absorbs a ton of surplus from the business sector and the government spends it on ways to kill people. That's very bad. The most interesting one, though, is prisons. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, a really cool abolitionist that everybody should read. She wrote this book called Golden Gulag, and it's all about how in the 70s, there was this huge proliferation of prisons across the United States, not because of some, upswing in crime rates, but because there was this kind of unique situation where a lot of the business sector had a surplus and the US government had a surplus. And so they built all these prisons on the premise of job growth, or it'll bring like economic opportunity to your community, which is extremely gross. So the choice that was made was, let's dump all this money into a good investment, namely prisons. And those prisons obviously have created an extremely violent world of mass incarceration. And so it's just to say that like these problems of surplus and what to do with it, they kind of end up in especially sticky situations when you have like extremely brutal governments like the Reaganite government kind of in collusion with like an economy that's running really hot, and they all have to figure out what to do with all their huge amounts of cash. And unfortunately they spend it on, brutalizing people essentially.
Right.
So anyway, a great book if you want like a sideways look at all this stuff. Golden Gulag, it's a good one.
Yeah, a great point. You could spend it on creating a, national healthcare service, but prisons also. Might as well. Just as good, I guess.
Just as good. All right. So I guess the key point, if you've gotten nothing from this like incredibly disconnected, caffeine-addled explanation of monopoly capital, is that having a lot of surplus is a problem, and trying to figure out what to do with it is another problem. We mentioned that we'd talk about how the monthly review has sort of started to explain the financial sector using these kinds of tools for kind of a long time now. And I've found that super interesting just in recent weeks, as Matt and I have been trying to explain how growth works in this book. And something Brandon Sweezy said already in Monopoly Capital, which was published in 1966, was that increasingly one way to kind of deal with surplus was to dump it into the finance sector, or sometimes people call it the FIRE economy, which stands for fire, insurance, and real estate. So these sectors are kind of absorbing a bunch of capital. And that is a really interesting observation to make in the 60s, because since then, those industries have exploded in some really dangerous ways for our own economies. And I thought it'd be good maybe to talk that through. The first thing maybe to note that's really fascinating is that the reason they came to that conclusion is because as Marxists, they sort of had this baseline assumption that capitalism is prone to these kinds of crises. And even though monopoly capital is trying to kind of create a steady pattern of growth, it's increasingly kind of investing in these more unstable or fragile parts of the economy, the finance sector in particular. That's really fascinating and something that they saw before a lot of other schools of economic theory. And the other thing to maybe say that I think is really fascinating about all this is that the one main reason that all that stuff got dumped into the fake economy, we could say, the fire economy, is since the 1970s, capitalists kind of decided to move all their production outside of the imperial core, outside of the US or the UK or whatever. So, through offshoring, this is like a common story maybe many of us already are familiar with. They moved all the manufacturing to the global south, where they could pay workers a lot less. They didn't have to pay for good working conditions and so on. And that kind of destroyed the economies of a lot of communities in the global north. And the problem with consuming or creating a commodity is you need to sell it to people who can buy it. And instead of raising wages in the US, for example, in order to kind of compensate for people losing a bunch of jobs, instead, wages stagnated from the 70s up till basically now, with a few exceptions. And in order to compensate for that, they kind of massively boosted the credit system. So you might not be able to buy a commodity with your wage, but you could buy it if you took out a line of credit. And that has kind of slowly introduced the debt creep in everybody's life. So now we're at a state where, you take on massive amounts of debt to do extremely normal things like go to school or, go to the doctor or, pay for your house with an obscene mortgage or whatever it might be. That the debt economy, ever since that kind of moment in the 70s, has sort of exploded. And it's the place where capitalists dump their surplus capital to ensure more growth. They dump it into creditors, into banks, and so on, because they know that they'll lend all that stuff, all that surplus, back out to working people who will then kind of end up paying twice for stuff, right? Instead of raising wages, they pay for the base cost of a commodity or service or whatever they need, and then they also pay on the interest. So it kind of guarantees this bigger profit margin in the end, expanding that surplus, but in ways that are, as we'll talk about maybe in a minute, economically super fragile.
Totally. And if you want to see, more evidence of that kind of thing happening in history, and you want some data to back it up, say you're going, whatever, the holidays are over, but you're going to go to your uncle's house for dinner, and you need to bring some ammunition with you. The Economic Policy Institute has a really, I think at this point, pretty infamous graph that tracks productivity and pay over time, which is really fascinating. So just like you're saying, Dean, the graph they have, it shows you sort of like the productivity and the hourly pay in the United States kind of rising together, starting in 1948. But by the time it gets to 1979, the two lines on this graph diverge wildly, where productivity in the economy goes way up. And by the time we get to 2024, it's up 80%, from 1979 to 2024, it's risen 80%. So productivity is way up, whereas the hourly pay has only increased 29% since 1979. So you have wages stagnating, but productivity growing. So where is all that money going? And then how are people affording anything? And the answer is financialization, credit. Everyone can, no one can afford anything, but they can definitely put it on a credit card and pay it off over the course of 4 years or whatever, just nuts.
It is nuts. It's nuts, and that's maybe one way that the working class in particular is getting screwed over by monopoly capital dumping all of its surplus into the finance sector for decades instead of paying you. I mean, the capitalists, they could just pay you what you deserve, right? Or
totally.
I mean, I guess they couldn't, because then they would lose their business, but they could definitely pay you more,
sure.
Pay you what you're owed. But they don't, because they don't have to, right? It's not illegal to do that. And if they can make money off of you twice by not paying you, first of all, and then also getting you to pay more out of your already depressed wage, why not do that? That's the kind of capitalist game that's being played that the rest of us are forced to play. There's lots of other problems with inflation and so on kind of eating into those wages as well. But the key is that capitalists are making more money than ever, and the rest of us are having our wages kind of, eaten away by the moth of whatever, capital accumulation.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe we can talk a bit more about like the wages part, because there's, I think, some more going on there with monopoly capital as well. So it is in the best interest of these big corporations who employ most people in the United States to keep wages more or less low. More or less, because there's going to be some difference between, corporation and corporation, but keeping them low does serve a particular advantage within the economy. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, monopoly capital, the defining feature is that there's like corporate price setting that happens. So, whatever, a coffee at Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts will cost around the same amount. Probably, one will be cheaper, but, you'd expect to pay the same amount because they set the prices together so that they can get the most amount of money for their coffee. Okay. But big corporations will also set the price for other things too, like labor. So that's why things like the minimum wage are so interesting, in a big fight often. So in the economic space, this process of like setting the cost of labor is called the monopsony. So basically the idea is, you have Starbucks, you have Dunkin' Donuts. Both are probably going to pay their workers a similar amount. And, other similar companies that fill, kind of similar market niches like McDonald's or Burger King will probably pay around the same amount as well. Maybe Starbucks, because there's all this like union activity. You might get like $15 or $16 if you work there, maybe more, like 20 even, who knows, depending on what state you're in. And then like but a company like Dunkin' Donuts, they'll probably pay you around the same amount, maybe a bit lower, maybe 17, maybe whatever, 15 exactly, in a state without a $15 minimum wage, maybe 12, whatever, but they're going to pay around the same amount. Basically, the point of doing this is that it kind of like keeps the pressure off between like quote unquote competing firms. You're never going to be struggling for workers. These corporations will end up kind of colluding on these numbers for the price of labor because they need people to work in them, right? And if one place ends up like paying way more than the others, then it kind of cuts everyone else off from the flow of labor, the sale of labor, which causes bigger problems and would start like a wage war, which I don't think really exists or ever has, but maybe a little bit. It would create a situation where someone would leave their job at McDonald's for a job at Starbucks because it pays marginally more or something, and that would cause all kinds of other problems. A monopsony and a monopoly both kind of work in concert to fix prices at a certain sort of like range, and then also fix the cost of labor at a certain range. All that to say that like corporations, like you said, Dean, kind of get you going in both directions. They pay you very little, and then they find ways to extend you credit to actually end up paying for things in the end, and you're kind of stuck in this awful cycle of no economic mobility, which is just what they want.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of saw that during the pandemic, right? There, as things were opening back up, you had all these economists and business people complaining that workers had too much power, that they were demanding, higher wages, or businesses found that they had to compete with each other to extend higher wages just to attract workers. And people were like, I'm not going to go back to a minimum wage job that doesn't treat me well or whatever in a bad situation and so on. And, the solution to that was to massively raise inflation rates such that people would be more threatened by that and cool the labor market and so on. So just to say, like, there's, even when there is kind of a wage war or whatever, probably saying it too much to put it that way, but even when workers have maybe some power or some leverage over the system, as marginal as it might be, that's viewed as like a crisis that capital has to solve.
Yeah, it is. Calling it a wage war, it was a dumb. I shouldn't have said that. But
oh no, you're fine.
I mean, but the point, like, just like you're saying, like after COVID, right? There's like this sort of like realization that people not wanting to work at a particular low wage job is like now a new barrier that they weren't seeing before. So, whatever, wages went up marginally after the pandemic, but then, like you said, like the interest rates go up as well to kind of cancel all out. So it's like there was a wage increase, but it's not, it's not the kind of wage increase that is really going to make a difference in your life in the grand scheme of things. The only way you can do that is by like, collective bargaining and organizing and stuff, but that's a whole nother story altogether. Yeah, I don't know. I think that like the people were calling it at the time like the Great Resignation. Nobody wants to work anymore, et cetera, et cetera. But it's like, so much of it is just hype because people ended up going back to work and they are caught back in the same sort of like trap of low wage jobs that they were in before, without much to show for it. So I don't know. The whole thing is very frustrating. I guess I just like get so bent out of shape when I start seeing journalists talk about how wages went up after the pandemic, because it's like kind of, but not in a way that is actually helpful to anyone's life.
Yeah, exactly. So that's how maybe it's affecting the working class in some respect, affecting like your buying power maybe. But there's a lot of other ways that the financialization of capitalism is really screwing people over and creating just a weirder and weirder model of growth. And maybe with the rest of our time, we can talk that bit through. So in 2008, there was a big financial crisis and everybody's talking about it. It had a lot to do with the housing market in particular. The short of it, I mean, the movie The Big Short, which is based on the book The Big Short, is not perfect, but it's actually not a bad way to wrap your head around that part of it all. They do a pretty good job of trying to like break down in a more or less entertaining way, what subprime mortgages are, for example, which is like a pretty hard thing to make interesting. And they do that for sure. The short version of the story is that basically the banks were lending, banks and like investment firms and stuff were lending mortgages to people that they knew couldn't pay it, which is pretty slimy. That's like a predatory thing. You're guaranteeing that they're never going to pay off their mortgage, which means either at some point you'll repossess their house and then be able to sell it again, or, you'll just trap them in a cycle of debt forever, making sure that you can always extract money off of them. It's a very yucky kind of thing. And for a long time, that is what lenders were doing. And on the stock market, at the same time, they were doing this really wild thing where they would take these shitty mortgages. They call them subprime, not quite prime. That's just a fancy finance way of saying shitty. They were taking these shitty mortgages and then kind of packaging them up with other mortgages and selling them to investors to be like, here's a great financial product, or kind of a bucket of people's actual mortgages, their livelihood, that you can buy and you'll continue to make money off of it. And at a certain point, people stopped paying their mortgages, not because they wanted to necessarily, but because they literally couldn't pay them, that they were underwater. And en masse, a bunch of people defaulted, which created this chain reaction in the speculative market, the financial market. And people, investors were losing money off of it. And that triggered a huge, even global recession, where all kinds of, because the financial system is so heavily interconnected, all kinds of investments started to become big problems. And, the short of it is that the government bailed out a bunch of these big lenders, even though they were extremely irresponsible. And everybody kind of pretended that they had no idea how this happened, which is really a wild thing. And that was also the Obama government's response, was to basically be like, you guys, you did a bad job, but here's basically a financial reward because you're so important to our economy that we can't really let you go under. So nobody went to jail, really. I mean, a couple people, but not really. No funds really even like fully experienced the discipline of capitalism, like in a allegedly competitive capitalist market. If you failed, you'd fail. That didn't really happen. So you kind of had this situation where the government is reinvesting into these lenders to kind of make sure that they keep going. They regulate them a little more. The banks got regulated. But private lenders also continued to lend and still continue to lend at pretty exorbitant and irresponsible rates. And the big question is like, why did this happen? And a story like The Big Short, the story they want to tell is that investors were either duped, or they were stupid, or they were irresponsible, or they were kind of high on their own supply. They were all willing to buy into this like goofy system. And that's like definitely part of it for sure. But the story that Marxists tell, especially the Monthly Review folks, is that at a certain point, because of the way that the surplus was getting absorbed into the financial sector. This was basically an inevitability. And maybe it would be housing, maybe it would be some other sector of the economy. But the key is the more money you're putting into kind of speculative finance, making bets against the future, the more you're kind of setting yourself up for the future to not go the way that you planned, in which case there's this huge economic crisis. And it's pretty compelling. You can read some, I guess, kind of boring, but I think very interesting articles by John Bellamy Foster and Fred Magdoff in particular, who have gone to great lengths to kind of explain how this all works. But the key here is that basically there's this wealth generation strategy, right? You're trying to grow your capital. You can't just keep putting it back into the commodity market or whatever. So you're putting it into these financial schemes that are becoming weirder and weirder until they finally sort of explode under their own weight. And the effects of that, like, it all sounds very abstract. It's a kind of abstract economic logic, but the effects are extremely concrete, right? Like, millions of people lost their homes. People had their entire retirements just like evaporate because investment firms lost all their money. These are things that, like, the money that's being made is being made at this extremely abstract level, but the money that's being lost is being lost at an incredibly concrete level. And I think that is a benefit of kind of a Marxist perspective, is to be like, who's really losing at the end? It's not really the capitalists.
Yeah, man, I find it so helpful to hear this kind of stuff explained to me, because I don't understand some of the bigger financial schemes and ideas in general. Like, just hearing you you unpack the collapse in 2008 is very good. It's like people always make fun of how abstract and stupid buying things like Bitcoin is. Like, I don't know, you got multiple slurp juices on a chimp or whatever it is, an ape. Your apes have slurp juices. No idea what any of that means. And I feel like when I read about like finance and like financial capital, I feel the same way. I have no idea what any of this means, because it is just like so much. It is a whole economy created basically just to pour money into, because they gotta pour it somewhere. It's so bizarre and foreign to me. But I guess what is so surprising to me, not surprising, it's not surprising at all. It's just like, what is so jaw-droppingly stupid to me is that this is like a real contradiction within capital that creates these actual problems where bubbles burst, and there's not even like a pretend capitalist solution to them. Like in the stories that we tell about capitalism, it's like, yeah, I don't know, you compete, you fail, whatever. I don't know, that's just the way capitalism works. But there's not even sort of like a mythology about it here. It's just like, yeah, and when these bubbles burst, like, then the government has to put money into them because the economy can't fall apart. Sorry. And I guess like that's the stupid part of it all to me, is just that there's not even a story here. It's just like, yeah, and when we play pretend a little too hard and it all falls apart, we have to get some more money to make the game keep going, and like that's the only way we can move forward. It's just such a bizarre thing to kind of get your mind around, but it is also like a completely necessary part of capitalism. Like, it couldn't continue on without doing this, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Bellamy and Magduff describe it as a Ponzi scheme, right? Something that requires a constant input of cash, or else it will evaporate. I think what else is interesting about it is, like, maybe there's 2 points. If you're getting lost in the weeds of it, and I wouldn't blame you because I have been several times trying to figure it out, the 2 key points that come back to me are always the primary goal of capitalism is to grow capital. And if you can't do that in your productive scheme, you're going to do it in some other way, and finance capital is the way to do it. So they're doing it because it's a growth strategy. But the particular strategies they have are increasingly fragile, and when something goes wrong, capitalism, as they say, privatizes gains and socializes losses. So that's maybe one key piece, is that capitalism has to grow. It can't grow in the same way as it might have before in the kind of productive sector, so it's growing in these financial ways. The other thing that I think is really interesting is, with the growth of the finance sector, that sector is also looking for ways to grow, right? It wants to grow profits for whatever, stakeholders, shareholders, investors, and so on. And increasingly, there's become kind of a situation where even basic parts of our lives like housing are being kind of consumed by investment firms or asset managers. There's a good book that I just started reading called Our Lives and Their Portfolios: Why Asset Managers Own the World by a guy named Brett Christophers. He's trying to kind of track this trend. And he pulls together a ton of great sort of economic journalism to show how, for example, like in a housing situation, like if you live in a big building, that building is owned by somebody, whether it's a single person who's a landlord or a group of people or even a group of investors, for example. So if you live in a city or a condo or whatever, you'd be familiar with that kind of situation. Increasingly, whole buildings are being owned by asset managers like BlackRock, or there's a bunch of other ones. The key is that their job is to manage the assets, or kind of the, for lack of a better word, like the money-making tools of investors. So they'll buy up a whole house or whole building, that is. They'll buy up a whole building being like, rents, we can definitely make money off of rents. So your landlord is not like a person, it's an asset manager firm. It's just like a kind of faceless group of people whose only job is to grow capital for the people investing money into that manager strategy, that portfolio. And that is really bad because an asset manager, like that firm, doesn't care about like your living conditions. Christopher's has this like pretty heartbreaking story in the beginning of the book about how BlackRock bought up this building and like basically just immediately let it go to shit, and eventually raised rents and evicted a ton of people as a result of all that stuff. And at the end of the day, like the kind of point of the story is, why did they do that? Not because they're like mean and nasty, even though they are. They're mean and nasty because they're trying to grow their capital. And it's easier to grow it if you like skimp on repairs or raise rents or kick people out who aren't paying because they can't afford to pay. And housing is increasingly controlled by the finance sector. And it's not only housing, like whole key pieces of infrastructure, gas pipes, water pipes, and so on are being bought by asset managers and investment firms. And those are growth strategies that like you can't grow your money through the traditional means of like having a business and selling all your Funko Pops or whatever. So you're going to invest all that stuff into an asset manager who will grow your profit for you by being a bad landlord or like controlling people's utilities and so on. Extremely troubling stuff. And that is sort of the direction that monopoly capital is going now. Not a direction of like more and more competition making the world cheaper for everybody else, but on the contrary, the opposite, like more and more profit that's making the world more expensive and shittier for everybody else.
I hate to hear it. Bad news about the world. There's already so much bad news, but now here's more. Just about the way that it works kind of day to day. I don't know, Dean, what do you think what's the use case for some of this information? Like, on one hand, you can kind of use this to sort of suss out, I don't know, pressure points, I guess, within capitalism. Where can you resist and like make changes in the world? Like, how can you make the capitalists mad by, I don't know, organizing the tenants in your building or something? Probably a pretty good effort. But I don't know, anything else that you see is particularly useful here about understanding capitalism in this like really detailed financial economic way?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of uses for knowing better. I mean, that's definitely one of them, knowing the kind of pressure points or understanding that like if BlackRock buys your building, you should probably know what that means. If an asset manager owns your housing, it's like good to understand that and figure out what that is going to bring to your community, etc. I think also it's important because like, I don't know, I find it's very easy living in an increasingly complex capitalist world to feel like you're just sort of being like battered around by the economy. You don't really know why the line goes up or down, and neither do any of the journalists who tell you that it's going up and down. They don't really know why it's doing that either. And to know why is not enough to change it, but it does kind of start to empower you, I think, in such a way where you can be like, all right, I know what's going on here, and I know kind of who I need to start talking with, whether it's my neighbors or my politicians or whatever, in order to try to break that hold. I think also, we've been talking a lot in the book so far about liberation theology. I guess this is why you have to buy the book, because we're not going to talk about it on this episode. But we've been talking a lot about how liberation theology has this really sophisticated analysis of idolatry, which we've mentioned on the show before. But the idea is that idolatry kind of like holds not just our attention, but things sort of exercise like a divinized power on us. They sort of like, they act like gods. They limit our imagination. They demand sacrifices and so on. And I think when we start to understand how growth is an idol in our society, it also helps us to start figuring out, well, how do you smash an idol like that? And it requires basically rejigging our society to not be oriented toward capital growth, which is a pretty tall order, but you're definitely not going to get there if you don't know what's going on.
That makes a lot of sense. I was talking about SpongeBob earlier, but let's talk about VeggieTales for a minute. Do you remember the episode of VeggieTales where they do worship the big bunny?
Oh, of course.
Okay. So,
I love the bunny.
Oh, I love the bunny. Anyways, it's just like that.
It's exactly like that.
Yeah.
It happens in a chocolate factory and everything.
It happens everywhere, but especially in chocolate factories.
Yeah. So I guess, the point of these past two episodes back to back is to kind of parse out the idea of growth as an idolatrous kind of idea, but also to say that it's not impossible to understand. It is like annoying to understand it. It requires reading a lot of very boring economy stuff. And I guess we're hoping that the book will make it less boring and more understandable and maybe easier to kind of parse out in a way that's useful. But I think, for Christians on the left in particular, it matters to figure out like how capitalists are using the rest of us to grow their own wealth while the rest of us are, seeing our bank accounts just evaporate based on like rents going up or groceries going up or whatever that might be.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you do support us, we are so appreciative, so thankful. And in return, you get a special spot in the sun of our Patreon-only Discord channel where we talk about, I don't know, man, so much stuff. Video games, we're talking about organizing, we're talking about mutual aid, we're talking about, other stuff. The Bible. Always
it's our number one growth strategy, just talking about stuff.
Then that's right. We're not growing the economy, but we are growing the big book of stuff we've talked about. I don't know what that is. The Library of Babel. I don't know. Anyways, you should join. It's cool. It's great to get to know people and like kind of be a part of a group of people who are, weird in the same way that we are. Always very nice. The intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Logical Spoon. And we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.